I don't know if you looked at the agenda that we had out, hanging on a poster outside the door, or remember what it said on the website, but it said closing town hall, and then it was a path forward, moderated by Michael Wall. And the reason why it's moderated by Michael Wall is because I have no idea what the path forward is. So I asked these people to come and join us to start the conversation, and then we'll move out into the audience to continue the conversation. And so we've got with us Mendel Stewart, Kris Preston, and Brian Albright. And what I'm going to ask them is just to give a brief introduction to themselves and their background, and then 2 questions. And the question is, what do you think the biggest threat is to biodiversity in our region? And what are you most hopeful about concerning the biodiversity in our region? And so with that, we'll start with Mendel.
Thank you. And the mic seems to be working. Well, first of all, I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for my career as a wildlife biologist, 34 years. I was the manager for the National Wildlife Refuge here in San Diego in the second part of those 34 years, basically moving here in about 2000. And then I went away for a little while, and I came back as the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Ecological Services Office in Carlsbad. Excuse me, and I retired about a year ago. So that's my background. So a little of my background. So the question is, what do I think the greatest threat is? So when I think about that, about a month ago, I went to an event here at the Natural History Museum where Richard Louv, who is an author and a journalist, wrote the book Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. Very good talk. He's also written several other books. He was here talking about a book, his new book, called Our Wild Calling, as I recall. And at the end of his talk, he had a question and answer period. And I took the opportunity to ask him. I asked him a question very similar to that question you asked us, Michael. And he went through a very elaborate and very well said explanation of what San Diego is. It's a biodiversity hotspot, one of only 25 in the world. Many imperiled species. He even said the number, around 200. He talked about it being great plant biodiversity here. And, he went through all the things that many of us know. And at the end, he said, the greatest threat is nobody knows that. Nobody knows. He went on to say that the majority of the public, what they do know about San Diego is it has great beaches and a cool zoo. He said that's what people know. And I guess I would agree with exactly what he just said. I agree with that. That's a problem. When I think about threats, I think about the threats that many of us know about. Invasive species, habitat fragmentation, climate change. These are threats. But I think none of them are greater than apathy. So if you take those two, both not knowing and not caring, I think we've pretty much defined the problem, right? So, so with that, I guess those would be what I would call the greatest threat. But when you come down to, the hope, what I see as being hopeful is because I've moved in and out of San Diego over 2 decades, I think I've seen changes here. The population is more environmentally aware. They're more active, and they're more involved in environmental issues. Most of those issues, the focus is on things like climate change, water quality and quantity, and wildfire. Those are the things that they're most aware of. So I think the time is right for us to be able to seize the moment and bring in another factor for people to be concerned about, and that's the loss of biodiversity, or caring about biodiversity overall. And so I think that the hope lies in the sense that we have a population that's listening more than they've listened in the past. And we've got an opportunity through an effort that started a couple of years ago by the San Diego Zoo. They called together a small group of conservation leaders and community leaders and asked the question, what can we do to keep species from going extinct in San Diego? And fast forward a couple of years, we've built an organization. We call that organization End Extinction San Diego. And hopefully we'll be kicking that off soon with a public announcement. But it's got a lot of involvement. In fact, it has involvement from the people that are sitting here with me. The Natural History Museum's involved, U.S. Geological Survey's involved, the County of San Diego's involved, along with the state and federal wildlife agencies. So we have a real opportunity to message to the public through this megaphone of involvement of all of these organizations that are currently engaged, to speak to people that are listening about what they can do about saving the biodiversity that's here in San Diego. So that's generally my answer to your two questions.
Great, thanks, Mendel.
Thank you. My name's Kris Preston. I'm a USGS ecologist, and I provide the science support for the San Diego Management and Monitoring Program. Excuse me. We coordinate, and so we work with many partners to coordinate regional monitoring and management of 111 species. We don't do all 111. There is a prioritization. We have 10 habitats that we focus on and 11 threats here in western San Diego County. And I've been working in San Diego, Western Riverside, and Orange counties in Southern California ecosystems since the early 90s. And during that time, I've seen a lot of change on the landscape. When these plans were developed, we were really conserving large swaths of land, and it felt really good. But what's happened since then is that the environment is changing, and the environment always changes. And we happen to live in an area that has the greatest variability in annual precipitation of anywhere in the continental United States. And so we're used to variable systems, but what we're starting to see now is things beyond what we had experienced before. And so what's happened is we've gotten these huge wildfires, which have really changed our systems by allowing invasive species to come in, and has actually knocked down populations of certain species. Others have done fine in recovering, as we heard about earlier today. We have things besides invasive species and wildfire. We have the climate change with the drought, which has done a number on a number of species. So fortunately, because we do have this normal environmental variability, a lot of our species are fairly well adapted to the ups and downs of that annual variability. And so, for instance, annual plants can take a year off in a really dry year and come back another year. So I feel like what's happening now that concerns me most, it's not just one threat. It's many threats. And during this last 20, 30 years, we've also seen a lot of urbanization and fragmentation, which is also affecting species. So I feel like our natural lands are being faced by a myriad of interacting effects. And some of them are nonlinear, and we don't even know the actual response of species to these threats. And so that is the real downer, and that is my what I feel is the negative side. On the positive side, I think we have a wonderful coalition of people, all of you in the room, all the land managers we get to work with, the scientists who are doing amazing work, the conservation programs, the land managers themselves, the county, the city, and then the zoo coming in, the Natural History Museum. So we have this partnership, and we have a management and monitoring program that receives regional funding through your tax dollars, and we're doing a heck of a lot. we are monitoring a lot of species and doing research, and we've discovered what is affecting some species. We've developed best management practices. We do this all without any publicity or visibility, so many of you probably not heard about us, but it's our partners that are able to benefit from this and do wonderful things on their lands. And so I feel that the positive is that we've really come together as a region to manage these species in a way that we're trying to ensure that they will persist for future generations and healthy ecosystems are vibrant, as the End Extinction Campaign likes to call it. And so I feel a lot of hope. I feel that science has to lead the way. And we have many partners I didn't even mention. I just saw Bill there that, the military also is a huge partner. We work with them, and they have amazing resources on their land. So I think that San Diego, Western San Diego is probably a lot further than other regions in bringing people together to work on these issues. And then we also have the benefit of so much knowledge in this room for the last 60 years or 80? Okay, whatever. It was pretty mind-boggling. So I actually am optimistic. And then I guess the last plug I'd like to put out there is the education. So what the Earth Discovery Institute is doing, what Canyonlands is doing, and all that, I think bringing more people into the conversation to counter what Mendel was saying about the worst threat of the apathy and lack of knowledge. So I feel actually hopeful, but we just need to keep plugging away.
Thanks, Kris.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Albright, and I work for the county in the county's Land Use and Environment Group. And I currently have a couple of different roles. My regular job is Director of Parks, Recreation, and Open Space. I'm also currently serving as the Director of Public Works for the county. So that essentially makes me both the county's Chief Conservationist and the Chief Developer. That sounds odd, I realize it, but I would argue with anybody that the best types of developers are those that have a passion for conservation. When Michael invited me to do this about a month ago, he did feed us the question at that time and asked us to think about it. And I started to think about it, and then I stopped. I told myself, I'm gonna go to this event for the entire day, and I'm just gonna listen. And I want to be open-minded, and I want to be thoughtful. And we live in a world that's, at least seems to me, to be very closed-minded now, and nobody wants to sort of reevaluate where they're coming from. And so, I did that, and there were some great sessions today. I really am grateful for the opportunity to be here and the invitation. But when I come back to the question about what do I think the greatest challenge is facing regional biodiversity, I have to say I think it's us. I think it's people. And I think it's the fact that we live in an area that is such an amazing place to live. And there are huge pressures on growth and development in the county. And I live in this world. That's where my job is. And, I see decisions being made all the time about how the county is going to be developed as we move forward and try to create a growing economy, which is a priority for most of the influential decision makers in our region, and try to balance it with a thriving environment at the same time. And so often people look to, when new things are needed, to look at areas where there isn't something already and to develop that open space. And there's a finite amount of that. And, I am not a scientist, but I live and work with many wonderful scientists. And the scientific community here in San Diego County is amazing. And one thing I know is that every species, plant, animal, and human, requires a certain amount of space and a certain type of climate in which to thrive. And, when certain species grow, in places where they're having impacts on other species, those are the things that I worry about in terms of future biodiversity. And so, it's one of the reasons I feel very fortunate to be in the role that I am in the county, and hopefully have an opportunity to influence it so that the growth in our region is going to be smart and it's going to be conservation minded. And I do have hope. And as I transition into the second question, which is what is the thing I think that gives me the most hope, it's also people. And one of the things for me personally is the fact that the face of conservation, as I see it, is much different than it was 20 years ago when I started here. I used to come to symposiums like this and workshops, and the folks that I saw in the audience were generally older than me and wealthier than me. And you know, but it was largely not a diverse group and a smaller group. And I think that the face of conservation has become more diverse over the years. And I think as a force, it has grown in the last couple of decades, and I think it will continue to. You know, I know the people that are asking us to come in and teach about nature connections and conservation are not who we saw before. It's not just all the suburban rural folks. You know, the inner city schools are begging for us now. They didn't always. You know, there's incredible partners out there. You know, Ben and his organization are certainly one of them that are connecting people that aren't naturally connected just because of the built environment that's around them to these amazing experiences. And I think that's gonna grow a force that helps us get to where we need to be in positioning San Diego as a place that is a biodiversity hotspot, not just a land of great beaches and, you know, fun times and, you know, a killer gas lamp district. I love all those things. You know, and the other thing I just would put on top of that in conclusion is getting back to Mendel's comment and some of his work that he's done on climate change. You know, I think that that's something that is resonating with many people now because everybody at some point can find something that in that world that affects them on a daily basis. You know, for me, you know, I started to surf when I moved out here 20 years ago because it was easier on the bones than running. And I surf a spot on a reef in Del Mar that's fairly close to my house, and I got to walk across the tracks and walk down a pathway on the bluff. And, you know, the pathway that I walked down for 15 years doesn't exist anymore. It's crashed off into the ocean. And you're seeing that all up and down, and that, you know, that was an eye-opening experience for me, and I think people are having that now, and I think there's never been a better time to mobilize a movement like End Extinction that can kind of bring it to the forefront. And so, you know, despite all the challenges, I have hope, and I'll end it there and turn it back to you, Michael.
Great, thanks, Brian. Give them a round of applause, please. So now what we'll do is I'm going to run around and bring the mic to people who might either have questions for this panel, might have questions for some of our previous speakers, though I can't guarantee that they're all in the room, or might want to say what your biggest concern is about regional biodiversity, or what is it that you find hopeful about for the future of biodiversity in our region. So raise your hand if you're ready. There we go.
Thank you. I've heard a lot about conservation today. I haven't heard anything about restoration. That's been what I've done in my career, and sometimes it feels like very teeny tiny little patches of things. Can any of you say anything about what you think is the importance of restoration? Is it a tiny little patch, or does it really lead us somewhere?
Restoration is really important, and you have to target it and you have to stick to it, because if you've been a practitioner in it, you know that, you know, once you start getting rid of some of the weeds and maybe you're spreading some seed and putting plants in, you know, a couple years later, the weeds are back. So it's a constant trying to get it to a healthy state. And then at some point, hopefully it's self-sustaining. And restoration is very important. Through our program, SANDAG, the Environmental Mitigation Program, has these Transnet Land Manager grants, and we're going to have one this September, and it's worth, it's about $1.8 million that goes out to competitive grants to the jurisdiction. So the county, the Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Fish and Wildlife, the city, can all apply for specific projects. And so I feel, I can't remember exactly, it's something like 1,500 acres have been done so far, but I might be wrong on that. Sarah probably knows back there. Okay, it's something like that. We've done an awful lot, and that's been vernal pools, coastal sage scrub, rare plants, dune restoration, and then there's also the environmental mitigation program is restoring impacts from roads. So those large lagoon projects, which Kim back there could speak to, are the restoration at San Alejo and soon to be Bataguitos, and then there's also been other restoration plan at San Diego. So there is a lot of restoration going on in the region, as well as the landowners, managers are doing their own restoration projects. So we try to all collaborate on this so that our money is being used effectively. Maybe we have matching funds so that it's not all coming from one source and we can leverage state dollars and so on. So there's actually quite a bit of restoration going on in San Diego County.
I think that just to jump in on this a little bit, that you said something about like, well, there is a lot of restoration going on, but clearly there's a disconnect in what people know about what's going on, and that gets back to Mendel's point. And I think I know that there's efforts afoot to develop some metrics of biodiversity conservation, management, monitoring, restoration that could be produced on a yearly basis in a report card kind of way. Some other sorts of metrics, possibly through the Equinox Foundation. There's some things afoot to try to create mechanisms to very easily communicate this to the public, but it's clearly a challenge. So next up, Tom Oberbauer.
Okay, you guys work for public agencies, or you used to work for public agencies, and one of my big concerns is the non-native species and invasive species. What kinds we seem to have new ones all the time. Oncocyphon, Sahara mustard, zebra mussels, all these different kinds of things. What kinds of things do you think that can be done for biosecurity for our region so we don't continually have new ones? Because even planting drought-tolerant plants that are not native to this area are basically planting potential weeds. So, do you have any response to that?
Well, Tom, don't watch Robert Fisher's presentation on invasive species and what's coming, because it will scare you. Brown tree snake, he says it's just around the corner. It's going to be here. There's several other species. I think awareness is probably the big thing. I think people need to know it. The ports need to understand it. Agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service needs to be looking for it. Ports of entry, when they're looking at species that are on the protected list coming into the country, they also need to be looking for those species that are non-native, and I'm sure they are, but they need to have the resources, and they don't have the resources, as you probably know. They just don't have the people to do that kind of work. But being aware of it, and all of us as a community looking for it, is probably the only solution, or stopping it from leaving wherever it was supposed to in the first place.
And also, we do have an invasive strategic plan for plants, and one is coming out soon for animals. Robert's group is in charge of that. We had a lot of experts come in. So we've prioritized, first of all, the plants. And so Sandag is paying the county and Jason Giesau to manage it, to go in, and the top tier, highest level invasive plants that are a threat that we can perhaps eradicate, control, they are treating those throughout the county, even on private lands. And then we have oncocyphon. We have a strategic plan we're putting together with our land managers to get rid of that. Same with ward's weed. And then for the invasive animals, that plan is rolling out, and that one has prioritized the ones that are on the horizon, that are here, that are out of control. And then we've also got an iNaturalist. Robert's group has put together an iNaturalist invasive project on iNaturalist, and you can go there, and there's all kinds of documentation of invasives, and that's looked at by experts to verify. So it's really starting to ramp up. And then in terms of biosecurity, I think you're right. The ports and all of us biologists, we need to make sure we're not traipsing around carrying seed from one place to another, or anything like that, so.
Yeah, I think they covered it pretty well, Tom. I guess the only thing I would add is I think partnerships between the environmental community and the land managers with agriculture and the Farm Bureau, the ports and customs, because it's been an eye-opening experience for me the last few years to see what's coming into the county from other places and the dangers that are associated with that.
Sorry, I have a question over here. So with the increasing pressure for more affordable housing and our increasing growth as a city, and yet the need to protect our really precious ecological legacy, how do you guys see planning tools, things like transfer of developer rights playing into that so that we can figure out exactly where we need to protect and where we need to build?
Well, don't jump for the mic, you guys. I'll take the first crack at that. It's a great question. There's huge pressure on affordable housing right now. The homelessness crisis has just added to that. I will say from my standpoint that it is a very complex issue. I happen to believe and have optimism with respect to TDRs, transfer development rights. I think that could be potentially a very useful tool for dealing with those pressures. Not everybody agrees with me, and in particular, as many of you know from having worked with them, the development community is looking to sort of a multi-tool toolbox, not having everything be achieved through regulatory control. But I like the idea of TDRs. I think it's a good way to preserve critical areas and to expand units in some other areas. But I'll just finish by saying in our lifetimes, I've studied this and I've been at all kinds of meetings about this. I don't think truly affordable housing across the board is going to happen in our region in San Diego. There are market forces at play, and that will ultimately determine that. And I don't think we'll get there through regulation. And the people that are saying that we will, it's one of those things, again, like I say, we all need to be open-minded, but if you look at the numbers and what it would take to get there, it would be a monumental task.
There's two things I want to plug, and your question is great for me to just plug them. It may not answer your question, but I'm going to plug it anyway. One is the habitat conservation planning that we talked about this morning. Getting that completed. It was 20 years ago, there was a vision to put zoning in place on the landscape, where to build and where not to build. That's important to go forward. The North County plan needs to be finished, and it needs to be robust and provide the habitat that makes for resilient landscapes for species and habitats. Okay, that's one thing. And the second part that I want to plug is the opportunity to fund the management and monitoring that Kris and others are doing that need to be better funded. And the only way to do that is through a funding initiative that Sandag is talking about trying to do in a couple of years maybe. We need as a community to get behind something like that and push it through across the finish line to get the voters to approve it so that we can fund the opportunities to create these thriving habitats. That was the vision over 20 years ago. So,
Great, let's give these guys another round of applause. So this brings to an end, I wish I had a bell or something like that, our third annual State of Biodiversity. We'll be doing same thing, same time next year. We'll pick a date and have it up there pretty soon. This is a weird story, and I probably shouldn't tell it, but so when I started at the museum, I started off curator of entomology. I was fresh out of a postdoc. And through some weird, completely bizarre set of circumstances, I became vice president of science and conservation, though at that time there was a different title for that. And I used to, that was when I got to introduce to the idea of a gala. Do you guys know what a gala is? Or a gala? I'm not sure how you pronounce it. That's how, like, Southern boy I am. But so I would have to go to these things and, like, meet what I thought were, like, really rich people, and there were really rich people there. And it was just, how do you talk? I don't know how to do this. It doesn't compute. But then, you know, over the years, got to know some of these people. And now when I go to the gala, I like see those people and I'm like, oh man, it's so good to see you. And it genuinely is. It's not BS. Like, you know, I really am happy to see these people that I've developed a relationship with. And this is our gala as far as I'm concerned. I'm so happy to see you and develop a relationship with you on a yearly basis. We should do it more often. But I hope you find the same sense of personal connection in this. And we'll see you on the rooftop. If you want to leave directly, we've got places to leave your name tag outside because we will reuse those. You'll see them next year. But if your name tag is your ticket to the rooftop, so you have to have your name tag to get up onto the rooftop. So you're going to go all the way up to the 4th floor. There'll be people there to direct you to the rooftop, and there'll be drinks and snacks and cool conversations and stuff like that. What's that? Will it be heaters? I don't know if there'll be heaters. It'll just be fiery, great conversation. So thank you all for coming. See you next year.